afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start this presentation by thanking all the people who have been part of my network of support throughout my personal and academic journeys, and it's especially hard to make a clear distinction of who contributed to which part when they overlap so much. You all here are also part of it now, so thank you for being here with us today. More directly involved in this project, I thank my advisor, John Kloof, and my project participants and partners in this journey, Michelle Brownlee, Kelly Church, and Rita Sodoma, with who I was able to learn so much and have beautiful, joyous, and enriching conversations, directly or indirectly, through their voices, their writing, their work, their teachings, their love and dreams. It is with and because of them that I decided to study ways of returning, Indigenous-Alien networks, and hybrid methods of a pedagogy of webs and institutions of art and education. Beyond an academic research project, the thoughts and experiences that led me to the conversations I read here, through encounters, making, and writing, are part of a search for meaning in my own experience in the US and possible ways of working as a Brazilian United Statesian student, educator, researcher, and artist. This project has many starts, many paths, many places that meet each other through a connecting body. It is a web, and I'm a point of encounter, an intersection where worlds meet. But the more I pick the threads that lead me to a path of mine, I find paths of others that inspire me to move into new directions. Because as I move, and each of the other intersected lives move, this web expands, it becomes a network. Now, of course, this description of webs that inform and support this study can become more and more complex as we continue to expand it. So I'll start by what inspired me when naming the project. How do I find meaning when I feel like I don't belong? When the way I speak, write, and think are qualified as a disability, while I at the same time feel the need to reaffirm that my experience is relevant. When my life cannot be described by a single category of identity or issue, but rather is constantly shifting. I refer back to what I know about myself. I return to my homeland and the people I've met there, the conversations we had, my story, my dreams, my inspiration. I seek ways of returning to myself, to my place, to my history, my values, knowledge, and experience. While I safeguard my own roots and ground, I encounter the ways of others who walk similar paths or in similar ways to mine, before or with me, in simultaneous and anachronistic journeys. I listen, observe, embody, write, and draw from them as I learn from what they share in common and create my own methods or ways of returning to what nurtures me. Growing from a soil of serendipitous encounters, those that happen randomly and change the course of everything that happened in my life since then, the threads that give meaning to this work impacted me so strongly that these movements, or these moments, the way of encountering others became what can be considered a research methodology. Emerging from a place of in-betweenness, or what Gloria Antaldua refers to as Nepantla, a transitional hybrid space at the border of cultures or touching worlds, these encounters drive, inspire, and ground me when, like a plant that needs fertile soil, finds itself existing as an air plant, being blown by the wind, I feel like I'm losing meaning, the nutrients of the land. With little understanding of what it means to exist in this environment and all that matters the most to me, my writing, my mental health, my quality and contemplation of life, my methods, poetics, and dreams, seemed with perplexity, I find places to land on, at least for 1 second, as the wind whispers me stories that float me to invisible threads connecting air and ground. I regain my ability to dream as I learn from and cherish others' abilities to do so. Within the large web of ways of thinking about these encounters between worlds, especially Brazil, Latin America, and the US, and institutional and non-institutional knowledges that exist across these places, this study considers ways of delinking institutions from Western, colonial, and imperialist systems of knowledge and subjectivation by aligning what Walter Mignolo referred to in an interview published by Critical Legal Thinking as two different but complementary trajectories of delinking: de-westernization and decoloniality. I will focus in this presentation on a few concepts that I consider central to this study's processes of delinking and relinking coexisting worlds. The networks of the uncommons and the transculturations that come of it, the Indigenous-Alien encounter that combines principles of Indigenous education and institutional context into a hybrid pedagogy of webs, and dreaming as an approach to teaching and learning, an institution that produces decolonial crafts and ways of postponing the end of the world by allowing us to imagine a new possible world without escaping, concealing, or ignoring the present or past ones. Since moving to Chicago, I have faced many challenges with adapting my previous identity and self-awareness to a new educational and cultural context. My different mother language and cultural background had to impact my mental health and be classified as a disability to allow for institutional accommodations. At the same time, I have been learning from observing current practices and having conversations with Native cultural workers in the Chicago area in search for other ways of working, while considering them in relation to ongoing discussions in academic and non-academic materials. As I noticed the movements they perform within these institutions, I was always interested in the relationship between their systems of knowledge, epistemologies, and their practices within and beyond these spaces. This transitional, in-between space of indigeneity and institutions of knowledge and power exists as a conflict zone where the transformations in institutional practices and definitions appear to germinate. Such processes of adaptation, transformation, and transposition of indigenous epistemologies and traditional cultural practices resulting from the friction with Western definitions of knowledge, culture, and worldviews operates similarly to what Angel Rama describes as transculturation processes that happen in Latin America. Transculturation became a fundamental framework to me when looking at the potentials of this encounter, this borderland that results from what Rama defines as cultural plasticity, the universal ability that any cultural group has of selection, both of its own elements and of external contributions, and of cultural invention based on the combination of diverse aspects, thus being a state that attests to the creative capacity and autonomy of any cultural community. It is in fact a search for resistant values performed in a cross-cultural process. In other words, the transformations indigenous groups have been powerfully producing as they refuse colonial domination, create spaces where they introduce non-Western perspectives within traditionally Western institutional spaces and relations. While I consider the possibilities being opened by indigenous-led transculturation movements within institutions of art and education, I felt that the practices it was presented to filled a gap, an open space that existed between my lived experience, history, sensibility, and poetics, and my own institutional path in the arts and education. Being a non-indigenous person, there are historical struggles that have not impacted me directly throughout my life, especially while living in Brazil. However, as I navigate through an intense and many times painful experience with cultural shifts that give a more fluid shape to my hybrid identity, as Lorenzo described them in her book Borderlands, La Frontera, I find support in many indigenous, Black, and Latin American scholars and cultural practitioners working to produce shared in-betweenness while reflecting on specific processes experienced by them and their communities. When institutional definitions and knowledge push me into the margins and lost meaning, they help me find the space that bridged me with the other side of the border. Their voices reminded me that, in order to move forward, I need to find ways of returning. Experiences of other transcultural and migrant students and cultural workers also allowed me to see commonalities beyond our specificities and recognize the in-between as a place shared by individuals of different identities and lived experiences. Although the people intersecting each other in this project may be seen as part of different categories coming from different places, they interact in this network by sharing strategies for navigating between environments guided by hybridity and an ability to adapt and build upon given conditions. This association by elements of subjectivity, stories, needs, and dreams, including my own as a non-Indigenous Brazilian United Statesian, was guided by the idea of the uncommons, which is defined by Marisol de la Cadena and Mari Blessed as this place where alliances and transculturation produce a negotiating coming together of heterogeneous worlds and their practices as they strive for what makes each of them be what they are, which is also not without others. From the uncommons, transcultural and hybrid places, methods, identities, and experiences create cracks that open space for other possible relations and systems of knowledge. It is a shared search that refers to an ecology of practices, a place and environment where differences are constantly interacting, supporting, learning with, and transforming each other, like a political pedagogical archipelago. In the territory of the uncommons emerges an Indigenous-Alien encounter. Different worlds meet and create ways of working together, as Guarani Ñandegba educator and social anthropologist Sandra Benítez and Spanish writer and curator based in São Paulo, Pablo Lafuente, described the learning and method developed through the collaborative curatorial process for the exhibition Jaguatapora, Rio de Janeiro Indígena. An indigenous and alien encounter. These two universes mirrored each other inside the museum in flames, says Gustavo Caboclo. The drawings you see here were published in the 34th São Paulo biannual educational publication, Primeiros Ensaios, in 2020, and are related to the artist book Baaraz Kawau, which means the field after the fire in Wapixana language. In his work, Caboclo draws a parallel between his own and his community's experience with indigeneity and the history of the Bendigo meteorite, found in the 19th century and living in the National Museum of Brazil collection when the institution caught on fire in 2018, destroying entire indigenous languages collections and indigenous items from the country's pre-Columbian and present indigenous cultures. For him, the dialogues and tensions between the definitions of indigenous and alien offer a lens for looking at the history of exploitation of life forms and living spiritual knowledge keepers seen by colonialism as resources. The journey of returning to the community from which his mother was uprooted and reconnecting with indigenous territories, worldviews, traditions, and spirituality are interwoven with his experience living in urban centers and working with institutions of art and education. Coexisting in the museum, exhibition, and educational spaces and discourses, indigenous objects and meteorites share space and muffled teachings about their homelands and experiences of displacement, dispersion, and return. The increasing number and complexity of efforts by indigenous culture workers to create dialogue with institutional spaces and power, although greatly unacknowledged and undermined as references for institutional practices, suggest that indigenous-led collaborative and dialogical ways of working continue to echo in many other initiatives undertaken in different institutions across Brazil and the US. Noticing these movements by indigenous artists, scholars, educators, and other cultural workers has allowed me to have conversations with some of them who are working and living around me, starting while I was pursuing a bachelor's degree and licensure in art education, then expanding into a broader context of universities and art and culture institutions of Brazil, especially in major cities such as Rio and São Paulo, and now moving to the United States and the institutions that surround me and that I encountered as I retraced the networks that connected them. Examples of these movements in Brazil include the production of exhibitions such as Jaguatapora, Rio de Janeiro Indígena, which happened in 2017 and 2018. Nacoada, Estratégias para a Arte Moderna, which looked at the history of the Brazilian Modern Art Week, the recent creation of the Museum of Indigenous Cultures in São Paulo, as well as several projects and efforts created by indigenous academics that follow the effects of quotas policies for indigenous inclusion in public universities in Brazil, such as Rede de Apoio Nhanguchi and Coletivo Indígena da Unicamp, that include political, educational, and cultural practices and programs to support the presence and work of indigenous students and scholars. Because of their historical ties to imperialism, museums and art institutions have been built with a knowledge building and educational role. While as a non-formal education institution, they have been increasingly demanded to hold themselves accountable to their social and political role within the local and global communities where they exist. These efforts cannot be fully practiced without acknowledging their historical complicity with an agency of imperial destruction. Both despite and due to their position of power, if facing the responsibility of rethinking many of the foundational principles that guide museum practices and definitions, the very conceptions of knowledge and culture that they promote and that guide our society might follow this epistemological shift. And locating these efforts and practices of Native museum professionals and indigenous cultural workers in such institutions, it is relevant to consider how they might tie into existing dialogues proposed by the encounters between traditional indigenous knowledges, institutional experiences, and contemporary practices, approaches, and dreams. In Brazil and Latin America's education field, the term indigenous education is used to describe the traditional ways in which indigenous communities teach, intergenerationally and transdisciplinary, their traditional knowledge. The practices of indigenous education are guided by indigenous perspectives that center care and principles of interconnectedness between human and non-human lives across time and geographies as part of the Bem Viver or Bem Vivir social contract, operating similarly to other indigenous traditional practices like the African indigenous griot pedagogy. The memory of buen vivir functions as a response to social, political, ecological conflicts faced by those existing at the encounter of divergent worlds. Contrasting with the colonial epistemology and representations, the system of knowledge of buen vivir, or living well, is one of the guides for the search for institutional recognition of indigenous knowledge and relevance through the consideration of a pluriversal world. For this reason, the networks I seek and weave in my practice and through this project sprout from a combination of my lived experience and a pre-existing política circular do bem viver, a circular policy of living well, that Guarani scholar Fabienne Cruz defines as a social practice of resistance guided by solidarity and collaboration. Translation and transposition between networks of material culture, symbolic meanings, and epistemological knowledge that inform the social policy become a method of resistance, a web of support, guided by indigenous epistemologies and challenging contexts or situations of hardship. It is a way of learning and producing knowledge, cultural and social practices. Visually and symbolically, the web is a foundational image to what in this study I describe as an Indigenous-Alien pedagogy, a pedagogy of webs. Inspired by centuries of resistance to colonialism and its effort to raise indigenous wisdom and cultures, and considered an iteration of the principles of indigenous education, this pedagogy is informed by a large ability to adapt over time to different eco-social political contexts while remaining connected to fundamental values required of those existing in hybrid territories. Throughout the past and present efforts of many indigenous peoples around the world, a fundamental element to their practices of resistance and decoloniality has been the institution of dreaming. Not as a mere oniric experience, but as a discipline related to their dreams, their formation, to indigenous cosmovisions, to the tradition of different peoples who approach dreams as a path toward learning, self-knowledge and awareness of life, and the application of that knowledge in their interaction with the world and other people. According to Brazilian indigenous leader, environmentalist, and author Ailton Krenak, dreaming as an institution and shamanic transcendental experience allows for ways of understanding the present and imagining futures that defy Western imperialist definitions of progress. Assuming an embodied and web-like approach to the present, these movements function as desire-based culture-making practices. This understanding of dreaming is aligned with Walter Mignolo and Catherine Walsh's definition of decoloniality because they are defined by, from, in, and with the struggles, political, epistemic, and existence-based, against coloniality enforced otherwise. Decoloniality's project and praxis take form in and contribute to the fissures of the dominant order, what they have called its decolonial cracks. From this perspective, dreaming can then be understood as a method of opening these decolonial cracks, as it creates a moment when the human chrysalis cracks open onto unlimited visions of life, keeping alive subjectivities, visions, and poetics of existence. The dream realm is not seen as a parallel world, but a coexisting one, registered in another potency. For indigenous peoples, dreaming is thus a strategy of resistance, of postponing the end of the world, of designing parachutes for our fall, the failure of the white, Western, one world. Engaging this realm and definitions allows us to imagine a new possible world thus, not by escaping, concealing, or ignoring the present or past ones, but instead by rearranging relations and spaces, introducing new understandings of what we recognize as nature or natural, and what we understand as knowledge and culture. In indigenous epistemologies, dreaming is an approach to teaching and learning. The structure of institutions, historically informed by colonial epistemologies and practices, has been persistently and increasingly infiltrated by indigenous cultural workers and knowledges since the encounter of worlds when colonizers invaded and settled on indigenous land. This approach to dreaming as a pedagogical practice enlarges the tools that deepen the cracks through which they infiltrate, making space for rethinking institutional definitions and methods in a transversal manner. Although decolonization, as Ip Tok and Kay Wen Yang have previously emphasized, should not be used as a metaphor, and specifically refers to the return of stolen land to indigenous peoples, decoloniality allows us to create space through movements of broadening and transformation offered by an approach centered in indigenous desires and dreams. By presenting these concepts and their admitted meanings in this project, I wish to highlight how Indigenous and hybrid practices and knowledges can be seen as connected to and existing and extending beyond pedagogical practices and frameworks. This supports my considerations when looking towards Indigenous knowledges and methodologies and building upon the current state of these discussions to reflect on, transpose, and expand on these definitions and practices from the specific context of my home country or traditional education settings into new ones that exist in the encounter and the in-between, a place from where other readings and pedagogical perspectives emerge. My own dreams, excitements, and hope guide this project alongside the ones shared by the project participants, Michelle Brownlee, Kelly Church, and Uida Sodoma, located and working in and beyond the United States Midwest region, in the case of the panelists present here today, and northern Brazil, in Uida's case. I approach the dialogues and reflections proposed in our conversations for this study by considering the multiple perspectives and histories that coexist between movements of colonization, but also of decoloniality, through resistance, desire, refusal, creation, and dreaming. Through verbal, observational, embodied, and written exchanges that included interviews, site visits, and bibliographic materials, I contemplated intersections between educational, artistic, museum, and research practices by these three cultural workers, while acknowledging both the challenges and potentialities emerged from their experiences within culturally formative spaces, ranging from museums to higher education institutions. As I learned from them in our conversations, I produced journal entries in my sketchbook, written reflections and poetic essays, as well as sketches and artwork about my shifting identity and my own perspective with the institutional context in which I find myself that supported the interpretation of the primary documentation collected. I believe our experiences, although different in some important historical aspects, suggest other possible meanings, knowledges, and worlds to be shared with and beyond the everyday locality of these efforts. This presentation is one of the ways in which the tools of the right-reaching position of the academic context as a knowledge-producing place can be used to describe and reflect on these practices within the broader panorama of transpedagogical and hybrid territories. This hybrid transpedagogical place is part of the work of Brazilian indigenous artist Uida Sodoma. Uida is an organic and spiritual entity that moves through trans non-binary educator, performer, activist, and biologist Emerson Pontes, fostering the recovery of the rivers, the fertility of the soil, and the rich diversity of plant life threatened by the Western way of living. Pontes shares their body and experiences with queerness and traditional indigenous and Western knowledges with Uida, the walking tree, who performs and speaks to human communities through movements between urban and natural landscapes in the Amazon, their hometown Manaus, industrial territory in the middle of Central Amazon, and around the world. Her performances are part of her teaching practice that aims to reconnect people to their own existence and to the land. Uida Sodoma's performances have been presented nationally in Brazil and internationally. Because I am currently based in the US and the geographical borders and distance produce challenges to communication within specific timelines, for instance, the pace of long-distance communication is different and sometimes non-linear. With my learning with Uida happened through published interviews, videos, podcasts, photos, and previous experiences with and research about her work in which I could hear and read her voice. The artistic, eco-political, and educational practices of Uida Sodoma rewalk paths created from the colonizer's perspective, drawing other possible connections, subterranean networks that structure worlds coexisting with the hegemonic one. Such movement is particularly highlighted through Uida Sodoma's Retomada series and the 2022 documentary Uida, A Retomada da Floresta, which is the rising forest. Her work associates dis and trans-embodied and photograph experiences of translation, endurance, spirituality, and transformation through performative actions and documentation. For Uida, all collective experiences are educational experiences, as she said in an interview from 2022 to Atmos. Her lessons take many forms and she assumes many roles. To voice the forest claims, sometimes she will dress in an elaborate costume and position herself in the landscape, speaking up to passersby, Other times, she teaches workshops gathering young people or community members to create relationships with the guardians of the forest and the spirits of the place where they live. Michelle Brownlee is a collections manager of the Field Museum's Native North American ethnographic and archaeological collections. In addition to this work, Michelle is an elected member of the Field Museum's Diversity, Equity, Access, and Inclusion Staff Council. Michelle started her career at the Field Museum as a summer intern in 2018 and was involved in a renovation project that gave birth to the exhibition Native Truths, Our Voices, Our Stories. She's also the co-creator of the museum's Native American Heritage Month programming. Her work with the museum's collection focuses on preserving and providing access to the Native American cultural material currently cared for by the Field Museum. Michelle is directly involved in the recent Andrew W. Mellon Connecting Communities to Collections program, which includes a fellowship that supports Native aspiring museum professionals in developing experience and a career in the field, as well as collaboration and knowledge exchange with Native community members on collections management, care, and curatorial research. Prior to joining the Field Museum's collection management team, Michelle received her BA in Anthropology and Native American and Indigenous Studies with a minor in Biology from the University of Minnesota Morris. My first encounter with her happened remotely in October 2022 when I was introduced to some of her work at the museum, projects she was involved with, and her commitment to exchanging with and sharing Native knowledge in and through the museum. Later on, we met at the Field Museum for a site visit, in which conversation flowed as she presented me some of the items in the collection and spoke about the relationships and collaboration she fosters with Native community members now and hopes to continue to develop in the future. Kelly Church is an Ottawa Potawatomi Black Ash basket maker, fiber artist, educator, activist, and culture sharer. A member of the Gun Lake Band and Grand Traverse Band descendant, she comes from a lineage of the largest Black Ash weaving family in the Great Lakes region, with each generation continuing the tradition of being a Black Ash basket maker. Growing up in southwestern Michigan, she learned basket weaving from her family while being taught her native language by her grandmother and learning and understanding the history of the Anishinaabe of Michigan from her historian father. She attended the Institute of American Indian Arts and received an Associate in Fine Arts degree before returning to earn her BFA from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. With her relatives' guidance, Church learned to select the best Black Ash tree in order to provide the best material to create different types of weavings, from utilitarian baskets to summer strawberry blossoms and conceptual artwork. Along the way, she has learned firsthand how the process of weaving a Black Ash basket is connected to biochemistry, forest management, pest control, indigenous language, family history, and deep ancient connections to the landscape from which her people originate. In her journey, Kelly has become an advocate for the survival of Native traditions in the Black Ash tree, the emergence of a threat to this traditional practice due to the spread of invasive insect emerald ash borer. She has been involved in many national and international art programs, exhibitions, and partnerships with government agencies to raise awareness, share information, and preserve traditional knowledge. She has received multiple honors and awards, and her artwork has been exhibited and purchased by both public and private collectors around the world, including the Art Institute of Chicago, the Field Museum, and the National Museum of the American Indian. I met with Kelly in 4 different occasions. After my initial contact with hearing the artist speak about her practice at an event related to a summer internship I did at the Art Institute of Chicago, I realized how deeply intertwined her artistic and educational practices were, and became interested in learning more about how she perceives the role of institutions within the context of her practice in Native communities. With the facilitation of the museum's Arts of the Americas curator, Andrew Hamilton, I learned about 2 events with Kelly Church, an artist talk and a slow looking workshop that happened at the Art Institute of Chicago in October 2022. And then I was able to speak with her there about her practice, about the Black Ash trees and the emerald ash borer, and also follow up with her later on with written questions that she responded. Michelle Brownlee, Kelly Church, and Wida Sodama's practices demonstrate processes of adaptation and transformation that happen through walkings across time, cultures, and places, aligned with what Paulo Freire Paulo Freire's notion of andariagem. As a trans-pedagogical practice, these movements introduce ways of occupying, inhabiting, and actualizing contexts as spaces of learning and of art, and ways of seeing existing power structures as platforms for use. Growing from the margins, the invisibilized worlds, and their holistic educational practices into the center, the institutional established worlds, methods, and definitions of art and education, they're working to produce a trans-pedagogical and hybrid network system of coexisting ways of working that operates as a pedagogy of webs within and beyond institutional spaces. By compiling and sharing these practices, ideas, and stories, including my own process and its impact on my subjectivity in learning, I hope to provide other cultural workers, artists, and educators positioned within and crossing the border of worlds, developing hybrid practices of encounter with and beyond institutions of arts and education with a support network, inspired by Indigenous epistemologies of interconnectedness. I believe these examples highlight the subterranean threads that structure the territory of education as practices of culture making in flux between traditional community knowledge and institutional practices, bridging different and interdependent worlds and interests. Moving forward, I hope that this project can inspire and support the research and development of an even more comprehensive and interconnected network of Indigenous, diasporic, and hybrid identity cultural workers' practices by expanding its analysis and reflections with scholars, artists, curators, and social movement groups across other territories. Thank you. We will now take a 5-minute break, as we said, for Michelle Bradley and Kelly Church to join us so we can speak to them and learn about their practices and their experiences as part of this project.